you are not afraid that people will leave. You are afraid that you will be the last person to realize they already decided. And that single fear quietly rewires how you read every text, every pause, every "I am busy," every slightly different tone. You start living in a pre-breakup timeline that only exists in your head, and then you act like it is reality. Quick thing before I pull this apart. We are building toward 1,000 subscribers, and your subscription genuinely helps this channel reach people who actually want depth, not recycled advice. And if this hits a little too close to home, hit like too. It tells the algorithm this kind of content is worth spreading. Now, let us get precise. If you assume people will leave even when they do not, it is usually not because you are insecure in some vague personality way. It is because your brain learned a specific strategy. Predict abandonment early so you can control the pain. And what is brutal is that this strategy can look like emotional intelligence. You call it being realistic, being observant, seeing patterns other people miss. But a lot of the time, you are not detecting the future. You are manufacturing certainty to avoid waiting in uncertainty. Here is what I have noticed across people who do this consistently. They do not mainly fear being alone, they fear being surprised. Think about that for a second. A person can tolerate loneliness. Many people do. What they cannot tolerate is the moment they realize they trusted the wrong signal. The moment they realize they invested and the investment was mispriced. That is a status injury, a competence injury. It feels like a "how did I not see it?" So your mind becomes a surveillance system, not for love, for risk. And the first genuinely important insight is this: your "they are leaving" story is often not about them. It is about your relationship to prediction error. Prediction error is the gap between what you expected and what happened. The brain hates big gaps. Big gaps mean you are not controlling your model of the world. In neuroscience terms, you can think of the brain as a prediction machine that is constantly updating to reduce surprise. If you grew up in a relational environment where people were warm one day and gone the next, or present but emotionally unavailable, you learned that surprise is expensive. So you do the logical thing. You lower your expectations preemptively. Not because you enjoy pessimism, because pessimism reduces prediction error. If you expect loss, and loss happens, you feel pain, but you do not feel fooled. If you expect loss, and loss does not happen, you feel temporary relief, but your brain does not trust that relief because it did not earn it through control. It feels like borrowed safety. That is why reassurance rarely sticks. Reassurance lowers your alarm for a moment, but it does not fix the underlying problem, which is your brain treating uncertainty as danger. Now here is where it gets interesting. People think they are afraid of abandonment, but the deeper fear is often unreliable attachment equals unreliable reality. Because when the people you depend on are unpredictable, you do not just lose them. You lose your ability to know what is real. So you become hyper-attuned to microsignals, facial shifts, response time, punctuation, energy levels, and you call it intuition. But a lot of that intuition is your nervous system doing threat detection with incomplete data. Let me show you what I mean with a common scenario. Someone you care about texts shorter than usual. Objectively, that could mean they are tired, driving, stressed, distracted, or thinking. But your brain does not sit with 5 plausible interpretations. It collapses them into one: withdrawal. Why? Because withdrawal is the interpretation that lets you take action. You can detach, you can test, you can become colder first, you can start preparing. Your mind prefers a painful certainty over a neutral ambiguity. That is mechanism 1, abandonment expectation as a prediction error management strategy. but that still does not explain why you sometimes escalate it, even when evidence says they are staying. So here is insight 2, and this one is uncomfortable. You may be using expecting them to leave as a loyalty test without admitting it. Not consciously, not in a manipulative villain way, more like a subconscious experiment. Here is the experiment. If I pull back, do you chase? If I become hard to love, do you keep loving me? If I act like you are leaving, will you prove you are not? This is not random. It is a way to convert a fuzzy internal feeling into measurable external data. Because your problem is not that you do not want closeness. Your problem is that closeness feels unverifiable. It feels like a claim with no contract. So you create a contract. You test how much inconvenience, emotional labor, or discomfort the other person will tolerate to keep you. And if they do not perform, you say, "See, I knew it." Notice the pattern here. The test is designed so that passing it requires the other person to read your mind, override your distancing, and pursue you anyway. That is not a test of love. That is a test of mind reading plus persistence. And here is the trap. Healthy people often fail that test. Not because they do not care, but because they respect boundaries. If you withdraw, a secure person might give you space. A secure person might not chase. They might say, "I am here when you are ready," which to your nervous system, can feel like abandonment, even though it is actually stability. So you end up selecting for the exact dynamic you fear. You reject stable signals because they do not come with dramatic proof. That is the paradox. You crave safety, but your measurement system only recognizes intensity. And this is where a lot of people get stuck for years. They confuse activation with connection. Activation is that charged feeling in your body, the urgency, the obsessive thinking, the need to fix. Connection is slower, steadier, less cinematic. If your nervous system learned love through volatility, calm feels like neglect, so you assume people will leave because calm is not registering as attachment. It registers as the beginning of disappearance. Now stay with me, because the next part is the most counterintuitive layer, and it explains why you can do this even with friends, co-workers, even people who have never threatened to leave. Insight 3. Expecting abandonment can be a self-protective identity, not just a fear. Meaning, it becomes part of how you know who you are. If your identity is the person who gets left, then staying with someone who stays creates an identity problem. You do not just have to trust them, you have to update yourself. And self-updating is costly. It destabilizes your internal story. The brain resists that too. So your mind will often search for evidence that restores the old identity. Not because it is true, but because it is familiar. This is a known psychological pattern. People seek self-verification. Even if your self-view is negative, you will gravitate toward information that confirms it, because it gives you coherence. Coherence feels like control. So when someone stays, your system does not only ask, "Is this safe?" It asks, "Is this consistent with who I think I am?" If it is not, you feel disoriented, and disorientation is read as danger. So you go back to the old map. They will leave. Familiar. Painful, but familiar. Let me make this concrete. You get close to someone. They are consistent. They communicate. They show up. Instead of relaxing, you start scanning harder. You think, what am I missing? Nobody is this consistent. Where is the catch? You begin interrogating small imperfections because you are trying to force the relationship back into your existing identity narrative. And if you find something, even something minor, you feel weirdly relieved. Because now your inner model has a hook. Now the story can make sense again. That is not weakness. That is a nervous system trying to maintain predictability. Now here is the midpoint shift. And I want you to really let this land. The assumption that people will leave is not just a belief. It is a behavior that other people adapt to, meaning you are not only predicting abandonment, you are shaping the game board so abandonment becomes more likely, or at least more rational. Because when you act like someone is leaving, you treat them as less safe, less trustworthy, more temporary. You disclose less. You invest less. You become sharper. You keep a mental suitcase packed, and humans respond to the emotional climate they are placed in. If you treat someone as temporary, they feel it, even if you never say the words, especially if you never say the words. So they start protecting themselves from you, which then becomes your evidence. You say, "You'll see, you are pulling away." But what is actually happening is a feedback loop. Your protective behavior invites their protective behavior. This is the relational version of what game theory calls a defection spiral. In repeated interactions, if one player expects betrayal, they defect first to avoid being exploited. The other player sees defection and defects back. Now both players feel justified, and both players lose the cooperative outcome they wanted. So when you assume people will leave, you are often playing a game where you are trying to minimize worst-case pain, but you are also preventing best-case intimacy. Not because you are broken, because your strategy is optimized for survival, not for connection. Now let us go one layer deeper, because this is the part most videos never touch. A lot of abandonment expectation is actually about time perception. If you learn that closeness can end suddenly, your brain compresses time. It treats stability as fragile and short-lived, so you feel like you must extract proof quickly. You must know now. You must lock it down now. You must resolve ambiguity now. That urgency makes you behave in ways that look needy or controlling, even if your actual intention is simply to feel grounded. So the question becomes, how do you change this without using generic advice like just trust? Here is the framework I want to give you. It is simple to say, but it is not easy to do. It is called separating signal, story, and strategy. Signal is what happened. Story is the meaning you attach. Strategy is what you do next. If someone texts you less, the signal is fewer words, slower responses. The story might be they are losing interest. The strategy might be detach, test, accuse, or pre-leave. Most people fuse these three. They treat story as signal, then they treat strategy as inevitable. Your work is to unfuse. You do it by adding one missing step your brain skips: alternative story generation, not positive thinking, not denial. A disciplined list of at least 3 plausible explanations that are not abandonment. Because your nervous system is not asking for optimism, it is asking for options. Options reduce threat. Then you run what I call the reciprocity audit. This is the part that changes your life if you actually do it. Instead of tracking vibes, track investments across time. Not one day, not 1 week. Across a meaningful window. Initiation. Follow through. Repair after conflict. Willingness to clarify. Consistency between words and actions. The abandonment brain tracks microsignals because it does not trust macro patterns. You have to retrain it to see macro patterns again, and then there is the hardest move. You replace covert tests with explicit bids. A covert test is withdrawal, silence, coldness, acting fine, hoping they notice. An explicit bid is saying, calmly, "I noticed I am feeling insecure, and I want a little reassurance. Are we okay?" Yes, that feels humiliating if you equate needing reassurance with being weak. But notice what you are really doing. You are taking your internal state and making it shareable. That is intimacy. That is what secure attachment actually is. The ability to disclose needs without turning them into a trap. And if the person responds with care, and your nervous system gets new data that does not require drama. If they respond with contempt or avoidance, then you get clarity without having to sabotage the relationship to obtain it. Now, here is the ultimate insight that ties everything together. You assume people will leave because you are trying to solve an emotional problem with a predictive problem. You are trying to feel safe by being right. But safety in relationships is not produced by perfect prediction. It is produced by repair capacity. The question is not, will they leave? The deeper question is, if something shifts, can we talk about it, repair it, and stay connected? People who do not fear abandonment are not people who are certain nobody leaves. They are people who trust their ability to face reality without collapsing. So the real goal is not to convince yourself that everyone stays. That is delusional. People do leave. Life changes. Death happens. Values diverge. The goal is to stop treating uncertainty as an emergency and start treating it as information. And the way you get there is by training your nervous system to tolerate the space between signal and story. That space is where secure attachment lives. Not in constant reassurance, not in perfect partners, in the capacity to pause and not punish. So here is a challenge that sounds simple but exposes everything. The next time you feel that familiar spike, that they are leaving sensation, do not act for 20 minutes. Do not send the text. Do not withdraw. Do not perform your usual protective ritual. Write down the signal. Write down your story. Write down your strategy impulse. Then ask one question. If I act on this strategy, what future am I manufacturing? Because that is the real power you have. Not mind reading them, but noticing how your expectation is shaping the relationship in real time. If this changed how you see your own patterns, I would love to hear what you noticed in the comments. And keep your eye on one thing this week. The moment you reach for certainty, ask yourself whether you are actually reaching for control. Because expecting loss does not protect you from pain. It just guarantees you never fully feel what it is like to be kept.